The following program is being presented by Stetson University College of Law, the National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and the Law, and the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance Capital Case Litigation Initiative.
Welcome to our Electronic Evidence Part 2 webinar, the 15th in our series of webinars for the Bureau of Justice Assistance Capital Litigation Initiative, Crime Scene to Courtroom Forensics Training. This webinar is produced by the National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and the Law, the Office of Professional Education at Stetson University College of Law. I am your host, Mercy Roberg, Director of the Office of Professional Education at Stetson University College of Law. Joining me today is our expert, Dr. Mark Pollitt. After serving over 10 years in the United States Marine Corps and Coast Guard as an aviator and intelligence officer, Mark Pollitt was appointed as a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. After serving for over 13 years as a field agent, forensic examiner, and supervisory special agent, he was assigned as the chief of the FBI Laboratory's Computer Analysis Response Team. During that time, he grew the unit into the largest and most advanced digital forensic unit in the world. During the last 2 years of his FBI service, he also served as the director of the National Program, Office for the Regional Computer Forensic Laboratory Program. Upon his retirement from the FBI, he began an academic and consulting career that continues to this day. Dr. Pollitt has taught at Johns Hopkins University, Syracuse University, and the University of Central Florida, and Daytona State College. From 2003 until 2018, he operated his own consulting firm, Digital Evidence Professional Services, Inc. He earned a BS from Cornell University, a master's in information management from Syracuse University, and a PhD in text and technology from the University of Central Florida. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and holds several professional certifications. Dr. Pollitt served for 4 years on the NIST Scientific Area Committee for Digital and Multimedia Sciences and the advisory board for the Center for Statistics and Applications and Forensic Evidence at Iowa State University. He is currently an adjunct professor at Syracuse University's iSchool. Your CLE information. This webinar is designed for both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Attendees who complete this webinar will be eligible for CLE credits. The Stetson Office of Professional Education will work with each individual participant for reporting specifics. CLE applications will be made to Florida and other states per individual request. Please email ope@law.stetson.edu for further information and state-specific requests. While the webinar is in progress, you can chat with us at any time. Use the chat feature found on the right-hand side of your login screen. We will answer as many of your questions as possible. Please note that we may not get to all of your questions while on air. If so, we will follow up. Electronic evidence can provide critical information on the manner in which a crime was committed. We appreciate the experience and insights Dr. Pollitt will be sharing with the legal community about digital and electronic evidence. I will now turn things over to Dr. Pollitt, and we hope you enjoy the webinar.
Well, good afternoon. And Mercy, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. As you have heard, this is the second webinar on digital evidence. The first one was done by a couple colleagues of mine, Josh Brunty and Mark Rausch, and they did an excellent job. This one is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be based a little bit more on an academic view, because that's what I am now, and it's been a while since I've actually done this work in the operational field. But I think it's useful for all of us, practitioners, prosecutors, defense attorneys, investigators, to understand a little bit more about why and how we do these things, and as a result, we hopefully will be able to do them a little bit better. I have an agenda here that I want to briefly go over just to let you know where we're going in this presentation. I want to first talk about the notion of digital forensics as a science. That's a topic that we've spent a great deal of time in the last few years trying to work on. And I think we're making some good progress, and I want to share that progress with you. The second thing I want to talk about is why digital forensics really is a little different from other forensic sciences. And I think that's useful for all of us, that we get a better product, we get the better use of our product, and we understand the product's limitations. And I want to talk a little bit about some technologies that are on the horizon, or in some cases actually already here, that are going to impact what we do in the legal field and in the forensic field for the foreseeable future. And at the end, I hope that we have some time to take some questions. In the meanwhile, let's move on. Just as a very quick refresher, there are lots and lots of different definitions for digital evidence and digital forensics. These are two that were adopted a long time ago, actually 1999, by the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence. And they're easy, they're simple, they're straightforward, and I can remember them. So that's what I tend to use. Digital evidence is information stored or transmitted in binary form. Now, that's pretty self-explanatory. I want to call your attention, though, for 1 minute to the first word in that, and that's information. And that's going to come up as an issue we're going to talk about later on in the presentation. The second definition I want to talk about briefly is digital forensics. And it's the application of science and engineering to the legal problem of digital evidence. And that one to me is interesting, not merely because it succinctly describes what we do in digital forensics, but it shows that there is inherent in it a balance between two competing disciplines, in this case, science and engineering. The way I like to describe science is scientists like to ask questions that they don't know the answer to, and engineers like to answer questions that they do know the answer to. And in digital forensics, we very often try to combine both of those in what we do. When the National Institute of Standards and Technology developed the Organization of Scientific Advisory Committees, OSAC, there was some discussion about whether or not digital and multimedia would belong. Ultimately, it was decided that it would, and it has had a storied existence in that area. And we talk about the digital evidence field. For the purposes of OSAC, that really means digital evidence, which is the traditional computers, networks, mobile devices, et cetera. Facial identification, which is recognition of, or the identification of people from faces, speech recognition, and the audio, video, and image analysis part. So all of them collectively we refer to as digital multimedia. I'm going to use the term digital evidence interchangeable for all of those as we go through this. But one of the things that OSAC was designed to do was to bring together people with disparate forensic backgrounds and bring them together to try to solve problems. One of the first problems that the Digital Multimedia Scientific Advisory Committee, or SAC as we call it, was asked about on the very first public meeting was, where is the science behind digital multimedia? And nobody had a really good answer for that. So being scientists, we said, let's go study that. And so we did. And 4 years later, we were able to publish the document that you see on the screen here, which is the second technical publication put out by the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, or OSAC. You'll see the link on there. I think it's in your program notes as well. And so it's easy to download. It's a PDF, and it has lots of good references in it as well. I'm going to talk about a few of the things in there, but there are lots more, and I encourage you to download that, read it, and take a look at it. With that, I have to start with a caveat and say that this is not the answer. None of us believe that this is the answer. Science is inherently evolutionary. In some cases revolutionary, but it's always evolutionary. And so as we move forward, we will refine, improve, and replace some of the things in here. But I hope that it's a work in progress for a long period of time. I put this slide up only because the people that contributed to this were phenomenal, and I want to give them the credit that they deserve. While I may be the first one on the list, the rest of these folks on here are really the ones that put it all together and did the hard thinking. And so I wanted to give them credit for what they accomplished. We worked extensively with all of the different subcommittees within the Digital Multimedia SAC, but also with others in OSAC and with the Forensic Science Standards Board, which is the governing body for the SAC, or for the OSAC. And it was a very long and arduous process. We did over 80 drafts to get to the document that you're looking at now, which admittedly is not perfect, but we started with the notion of what is the science behind digital and multimedia forensics. And as I say, that started in 2015, and we're still struggling with it. Well, most academics would start with the literature that is out there. It turns out that if you look at most of the forensic science textbooks, at least the general textbooks in forensic science, most of them focus on the individual disciplines and the sciences behind them. Rarely do you find anything approaching a paradigm overarching all of forensic science. One exception to that is a book by Nora Inman and Keith Inman and Nora Rudman, is their Principles and Practice of Criminalistics. And it's the only textbook that I know of that lays out a fundamental scientific paradigm for what it is that forensic science does. And it said that, in essence, it answers 5 fundamental questions. And these questions can be adapted to any forensic discipline and to any type of examination. And that, to me, is pretty revolutionary. And if we think about it, what forensics does is answers questions. And it actually answers a number of different kinds of questions at a number of different levels. It answers questions on a purely scientific basis. What is this? How does it work? And what does this result mean from a clinical perspective, if you will? We answer indirectly very often investigative questions. Who, what, when, where, how, and why. And our work is used to answer judicial questions, legal questions. While we don't answer those questions directly, right, our work is used to answer that. So we're in the question answering business, but knowing which kinds of questions we're asking is crucial to the practice of forensic science overall, and especially in digital forensics, as we'll look at a little bit later. This is a bit of an eye chart, but we basically looked at all the different things that we do in particularly digital and multimedia, but it pretty much applies to the other forensic disciplines as well. And we said, which of these things are those that actually are core to what we're doing, and where does this scientific thinking, reasoning, logic go? And so we worked it out, and we came up with this chart along with a lot of text to go with it. But it's important to separate out a couple of the things. The items that you see on your left, the forensic operational techniques, these are the things that we do to get and preserve our evidence. And while these things have to yield a reliable and authentic result, they are primarily mechanical in nature and don't necessarily involve a great deal of judgment or depth of knowledge. A lot of these things can be done by people who are only nominally trained. Forensic activities, on the other hand, these are things that require knowledge, skills, and abilities, and which have to be done in the context of forensic science, which means that there has to be a quality program there. There have to be procedures, standard operating procedures, et cetera. There has to be training, there has to be certification, there has to be accreditation, all of these things, which will then allow us to improve the quality of each of those steps. The core forensic processes are, I like to look at them as the black box translator between what we're being asked to do and the nuts and bolts of what we have to do. As you're going to see in a minute, in some disciplines that's pretty straightforward, and digital forensics, it really is one of the core problems that we have to solve. Those four domains that we talk about in there, the tools and technologies provide the ability to do the job. And those are things that we can test, we can evaluate, and we can verify. The procedures are the activities, the forensic activities, and standardization and supportable methodologies are crucial here. A lot of the scientific working groups that eventually evolved into the OSAC have done a really good job of that. The Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence has done a good job of moving that ball forward. Not to say that we're where we need to be right now, but we're well on our way, and I think that that part is moving along pretty well. The core forensic processes, and that's the questions answered and asked, that's one that's a little tougher because it's fundamentally a systematic problem. It requires good communication between the customers, whether that's investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and to a degree the juries, and the forensic practitioners themselves. And forensic practitioners need to be able to look at what they're being asked and form forensic questions that are answerable by the science behind their particular discipline. And then the reasoning part of it is the area that is perhaps the most difficult, because it's internal to the examiner, it's internal to the client, the customer, the user, but it's also where we eliminate bias and that sort of thing. And that's something that we're working on. And one of the areas that we looked at, and I just want to move this slide back for a minute to just point out something here. When we talked about having the core forensic processes, I didn't list all of them for the book. It's located in the slide before, but one of them is a little different, and it is not included in any form in the Inman and Rudin version. But in this particular case, we're talking about evaluation. There was a recognition as we went through the discussions in these that we do evaluation on a routine basis at every step of the forensic process. And those are important, but the evaluations that everybody worries about are the results, opinions, and conclusions part. So we reviewed that a little bit as well. And we came to this notion that there are really kind of two parts of the evaluation process. One can be shorthanded to being an internal process or known as the strength of evidence, and the other being the external or the strength of the hypothesis. The idea behind the strength of evidence is that we have to assume that both the positive and the negative, the null and the substantive claims are true and evaluate how strong are those claims individually. And so you end up with a balance between those two of one is higher or lower or they're not. All right. Externally, we're talking about the confidence of whatever claim is made subsequent or whatever claim is made with regard to the overall matter at hand. And the strength of evidence may be very high, but the totality of circumstances, including all of the other evidence that's acquired and presented in court, may make that strong opinion not very useful. So we talk about that, and it's probably one of the most contentious issues that we have right now in the forensic science community is how to deal with those two notions. But to illustrate where we, at least I and a couple of my co-authors think we are, is that, as an example, you have a cellular phone triggered IED, and you develop a suspect. The number called between the trigger phone and the IED phone, the IMEI, the ESN, the cell tower data, all matches. The suspect's DNA is present on the phone. So if you say claim zero is that there's no chance that that phone triggered that device, then you have a very low likelihood of that phone being used. On the other hand, if you say that all of those things that you've learned above result in a very high likelihood, that would be claim one. So you've got a low strength of evidence on claim zero and a very high one on claim one. And I think the slide is got strong on both of them, and that's not correct. I'll try to get that fixed before they post the slides. On the other hand, the strength of hypothesis, you have the results of the cell phone examination, which in total are a very high likelihood that this phone was used. And by the way, I want to separate out the phone and the subject here for just a minute. That there was a very high probability that this phone was used, and so you have a strong strength of evidence for the phone. But there's some additional testimony that the suspect reported the phone stolen sometime before the event. The suspect was observed many miles away from the bombing site, and so while you may have a strong strength of hypothesis that this phone did it, you have a very weak strength of hypothesis that the suspect did it. So don't know if I've helped or hurt on that. But that's where we're trying to get to there. The kind of takeaway for this whole process is that we're trying very hard to look at what we do, how we do it, and make it as scientific as we can. And we've looked towards history, we've looked at each other, we've looked at what we're doing, and we're trying to reach out to other communities to try to make digital forensics the strongest and most scientific of all the disciplines. We're not there yet, but we're trying. The document that I talked about isn't the answer, but I think it's going to help to coalesce eventually a paradigm that will become the standard for digital evidence as we move forward. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next section. What makes digital evidence different? And I will apologize to any forensic scientist out there that takes offense to what I'm going to say. It's my view and my view alone. We're different for a number of reasons. One, it is really, really new. There was no such thing really as digital forensics until the 1980s, and even then it was very unheard of, not very often practiced. It wasn't until the early 1990s that even the federal agencies started to develop programs in this area, and as somebody that was there at the time and doing it, frankly, we weren't doing a very good job of it, but it was all we knew, and there was nowhere to learn it. We all learned from each other, and in fact, all of the early training programs were all a matter of having practitioners that had done this stuff train other practitioners of how they did it. And while we did things better as we went along, we had a long way to go. And it wasn't done in a academic or a forensic or a professional basis, really. It was done as a problem-solving issue. But it didn't take very long. In fact, about 10 years. From the early 1990s to the late 1990s, we went from having a few people doing a few cases to virtually every law enforcement agency in the world needing these services, and many of them providing them with whatever resources they had or could afford. In many cases, this was minimal or no training, minimal equipment, and an awful lot of hard work. But larger organizations like some of the federal agencies developed very large, very robust programs, but even they had tremendous difficulty keeping up with the demand. The problem was not merely the demand, it was the fact that the technologies that were needing to be examined were changing dramatically. It's hard in 2019 to think back to the notion that in 1993, for most people, it was no such thing as an internet, and let alone a cell phone. And in 10 years, we had the dot-com bust. So it was a tremendous change in technology, and that continues. But one of the things that's kind of different about digital evidence with regard to this velocity as well is this notion that while the manufacturers and the designers produce a technology and they think they know what it's going to be used for, once it gets out into the public, out into the wild, people use those technologies in new and different ways. And very often they combine technologies, and they combine the way that these technologies are used. And so over time, these have all evolved, and they've evolved much faster than we have the ability to write programs and protocols and SOPs and create groups to study them, et cetera. So this is an ongoing issue that's not getting any easier, but it is really fundamentally different, I think, than a lot of other disciplines. And the volume of data has just increased dramatically. The questions we get asked get much more complex as well. Nearly every human activity that you do in this day and age is recorded digitally somewhere, somehow, in many cases, multipliciously. More and more, there are additional sources of data about what activities we have. People are utilizing the digital ecosystem, to use the phrase, in much more creative ways. The smart home was a joke a few years ago, and it was looked at as something reminiscent of the Jetsons. But yet, in a recent walk down my neighborhood, my house was the only one that didn't have a digital doorbell. So we're seeing people adopt these things and integrate them into their own lives. And so as a result, we as forensic practitioners get asked to look at more different things that are connected in more different ways to establish new and more difficult and more complex behaviors. And because so much of our work is dependent on identifying behaviors, it can't be done in a vacuum. You can't merely look at a device and answer the questions that need answering in order to look at a potential behavior, because that behavior can be done in so many different ways. Volume. My desktop at home has the equivalent of what the Library of Congress had in digital form in 1983. And it's not the only desktop that I own. Cell phones are leaving breadcrumbs every time they open something, every time they connect to something, every time they do something. And just how much they're doing this is shocking. When we see a car with cameras and antennas on it going by from a popular internet search firm, it is going down the street collecting incredible amounts of data. And that's how your cell phone knows what the GPS is inside of your building, because it not only collects the pictures, it collects all the Wi-Fi and cellular data, etc. So the technologies to collect data is huge, and then the ways to share it have become ever more capable. The days of 1200 baud and 2400 baud modems have given way to gig internet at home and 5G cells. The velocity is incredible. The downside to this, which is not particularly a scientific problem, but users will almost always opt for convenience over privacy. And so we're rapidly getting to the point where users have no privacy from anybody except government, because they've given up their privacy on most of the commercial sites. If you find a gun and you find a bullet and you find a shell casing and you take them to a forensic examiner, the firearms and tool marks examiner knows exactly what to do, because he does exactly the same thing with those things virtually every time. And you know what answers are going to come back. Either this gun fired that bullet, this gun didn't fire that bullet, or I can't tell. Those are pretty much the questions and answers. For the digital forensic examiner, who gets brought a laptop and a cell phone and says, tell me what Johnny did, who did he talk to, what did he say, that's a much more complex question. And the answers are likely to be A, too large, and B, probably not particularly focused. There is, of course, the issue of an innate bias for that. This is one of the reasons why those forensic questions are so crucial in digital forensics. Because in the case of the firearms and tool marks examiner, we're talking about identification of a bullet and a gun, and we're talking about association of that bullet to that gun. Those are the only two questions, and they're pretty straightforward. In the case of the cell phone and the laptop, we have questions of identification, classification, association, reconstruction, what happened. And if we don't refine those questions so that they can be answered clearly, we're going to end up with too much or too little data, and we're going to have an inherently incomplete and perhaps biased examination. So bias is a very difficult issue, not the least because we're dealing with information and knowledge, not data. And I'm going to go into that in the next section. But it's important, if we're not being asked as forensic examiners to answer questions that can be answered exclusively through finding a piece of data, then anything beyond data requires some interpretation. And that interpretation leads to the potential for bias. But if we don't have the context, then we can't ask the question efficiently or effectively. And so I'm going to move into our next topic here, which is this notion of knowledge management. Now, knowledge management is a field that developed in the 1980s in the business community because it understood for the first time that knowledge was in many ways a more valuable asset than the physical assets that organizations have. And when I first heard about it was when I went to the National Defense University, and they were talking about knowledge management and how knowledge management worked. It suddenly occurred to me that the organization that I worked for, the FBI, wasn't in the business of putting bad guys in jail, but was rather in the knowledge management business. And that in forensics, we are, particularly digital forensics, big-time knowledge managers. So maybe we should at least understand some of the principles of knowledge management and apply them. I was working in a period that was before the days of electronic discovery, and I would argue for those of you in the legal field that electronic discovery is all about knowledge management. And perhaps in some ways, the legal profession may even be a little ahead of law enforcement in that regard. But if I give you an example, we have a bucket of data, just a bunch of numbers and letters. In and of themselves, they don't mean anything. And while you can think that you know what it means, you don't really know because they are just numbers and letters. You need some sort of an external context to understand what that means. So if I tell you that AA is an abbreviation for American Airlines, and that one of the number 11s relates to a flight number, and that the 2001 is in fact a year, and the other 11 is the day of the month, and that 9 is the month, then you have some context for what it might be. It's an American Airlines flight on September the 11th, 2001. That, the first part is data. This is information. Knowing what the significance of that is knowledge. Taking external information and applying it to the context of information yields knowledge. Having an external context around data gives you information. And so it's important for us in digital forensics to recognize that we're looking at and we're processing data, but we have to find not only the right context, but we have to answer the questions in the appropriate context for what's being asked. And if you stop and think about it, data on computers has lots of different contexts. Where was it on the computer? When was it put there? When was it created? When was it used? How was it used? How was it communicated? How was it viewed? All of these things are different contexts for the very same piece of data. Knowing which context you're looking for, you have to design, in effect, a separate examination or a unique examination for each one. Data are pure values, representation whose context is not defined. They are, in a lot of ways, a digital forensic examiner's dream. You tell me, find me this string, this set of numbers, this set of letters, anywhere in a hard drive, that's all I want. That's easy. We have lots of tools that'll do that sort of thing. But if you want that string and you want to know what the context for that is, then I have to work backwards and find where it is, and then find if there's a single context or multiple contexts for it. And that's information. What you do with that information, where it fits into the case, is about the knowledge. Now, in some cases, having that knowledge would be really, really useful. One time I was asked to look at a laptop that had some pictures on it, and I was asked if I knew what the significance of it was. And the short answer was, I had no idea. One of the problems was that I had no idea where the pictures were taken. I had no idea whose pictures they were. I had no idea where that data came from. It's a little hard to answer a knowledge question. I could look at those pictures and I could tell what camera it came from. I could tell you the date and time it was photographed. But those are information, and I basically gave them all the information that I had relative to the data that was available to me. Answering the bigger question is more difficult. Digital forensics is much more of a process. While all forensic disciplines go through this process, some are more streamlined, if you will, than others. Collection. Collection is where you actually acquire the evidence, whether it's the forensic examiner or the crime scene investigator or the investigator themselves, whoever gets the data and puts it into the forensic examination system. Examination is the application of technical means to extract information of value from the collected evidence. And analysis is the interpretation of that information into knowledge for the end user, for the customer, and reporting, of course, is sharing that. So we're doing what is fundamentally a knowledge management process. But again, all of them depend on progressively more complex contexts, and trying to standardize them and make them efficient and effective and unbiased is very hard. In traditional forensics, crime scene people pretty much know what to collect. Now, the standing joke in our field is that if it's digital evidence, if it has a plug, you give it to the digital evidence folks. Investigators typically know what to ask for a lot of the examinations in traditional forensic science. They know what the DNA folks can do for them. They know what the firearms and tool marks folks can do for them. They may know what the hairs and fibers folks do for them. In digital forensics, it's a little bit more difficult because, okay, here's the computer, solve my case for me. Tell me what's on here. Tell me what's useful on here. That's not a very efficient and effective way to do knowledge management, and it certainly isn't an unbiased way to do a forensic examination. One of the big problems that I had as a manager of digital forensic examiners is that they very often would do things with the evidence not because they had a particular reason to do it vis-a-vis answering a specific question. It's because they were given a general question and they were trying to find as many answers as they could, and so they would do things more because they could than because they knew how the answer was going to fit into the question. That's not the optimal way of doing these things. But I guarantee that if you sit down with any 5 digital forensic examiners and ask them how they do that particular issue of examination planning, you will get 5 very different answers. And if you throw some beer in there, you'll probably get a pretty good fight. One of the other problems that we alluded to in the volume thing is we collect huge amounts of data. After 9/11, the FBI collected about 125 terabytes of data, which at the time was a staggering volume of data. Now, that's not even a lot. The numbers are huge, and the amount of processing power that it takes is huge, and it takes longer and longer to do these things. So in some ways, we're fighting an uphill battle just with the volume alone. But typically, investigators will ask us a investigative question. I've got this cell phone. I think Joey's selling drugs. Prove it for me. That's not the best way to start an exam. So what the examiner should be doing is saying, okay, tell me what phone numbers are associated with your suspect, or suspects, and do you have a time frame, and do you have locations, whatever, and I will look for those things in the cell phone, rather than just giving you everything out of the entire cell phone. In the old days, maybe that was okay, but these days there's an awful lot of data there, and arguably some of it is not only not useful to the investigation, some of it may be privileged, and some of it may not be within the scope of your investigation or your legal authority. We have lots and lots of good forensic tools, but they're sledgehammers. They basically will process things the way we tell it to, but they just give us a whole big pile of data to then have to sift through. And unfortunately, in many cases, it's the Mark I, Mod I eyeball that determines what is or is not pertinent in a given data set. And we're trying to find better ways of doing that. And there may be some technologies down the pike that help. But in the meanwhile, examination planning is key. And examination planning is where you take those questions and you try to refine them with your client as best you can, and then you design your examination to answer those questions as succinctly and directly as you can. And then you can run a fairly efficient examination with a minimum of bias. But you have to have a certain prior knowledge ahead in order to do good examination planning. This is just another view of the contexts. The investigators are taught from day one, as I was, to answer the who, what, when, where, how, and why. Whereas the forensic questions we're learning to ask as forensic examiners are authentication, identification, classification, association, reconstruction, and evaluation. But we have to ask those questions of data within context, and the context that you see on the right side there are, for the most part, system and systematic contexts, but there are also time contexts, there are also location contexts, there are also communications contexts. So all of these things need to be answered, and it's somewhat like a three-dimensional Rubik's Cube, but it's why what we do is hard. And so when you take a look at that process in a little bit more detail, you see collection, okay, no big deal. But before you even start, you have to start doing your examination planning from the get-go. And what exactly is my tasking for this particular examination? What are the forensic questions that I'm asking, or being asked to answer? What are the forensic hypotheses that would support or refute those particular forensic questions? Right? And then how do I design an examination to extract data in those contexts so I now have information that I can evaluate to determine if they do support or refute the hypothesis, If I, in fact, am responsive to my tasking, and if I do, I've done my analysis, I can do my report, and I'm done. That's a process that needs to be done informally, if not formally, certainly formally in large examinations and large cases. But it's not something that many other disciplines have any requirement to do. My next area that I want to talk a little bit about are some of the new technologies. Now, mobile devices aren't new, right? But how they're being used is constantly new. Cloud computing you may have heard of. Internet of Things you've probably heard of, but probably haven't thought about what its significance to forensic science is. Certainly you've heard about drones. They're a fascinating topic for a lot of reasons, and artificial intelligence. So, mobile phones, it's not just about cell phones now. It's about any device that can move around. And they are becoming more and more pervasive and more integrated. I was surprised, somebody was actually surprised when I was at a cash register the other day because somebody was paying in cash. The use of cash and the use even of credit cards is declining with the use of all these payment systems like Apple Pay and that sort of thing. Shopping is being done more and more online using mobile devices than desktops. We're using our mobile devices for things we never would have dreamed of before. When you travel, you need your cell phone because you use it for your boarding pass. You use it as your passport to get back into the country, to go through the expedited line. And you get to your hotel, you actually use it to open the door of your hotel room. These are all uses for mobile devices that were never anticipated. And if you want to get a complete picture of what somebody is doing, you have to start thinking in those terms. They're controlling our cars. I end up renting a lot of rental cars, and every one I have to spend at least 15 minutes trying to figure out how to get the silly computer to work in the car. Our phone systems are all digital now, and everybody's security system is digital now. And all of these things are taken for granted. They're all background noise. We don't even think about them. Every time somebody comes out with a new app or a new way of doing this or a new connection or a new standard to connect new devices, it's a whole new bailiwick for digital forensic examiners. They have to look at it and go, how does this work? How do we tell what was done? Right? What are the artifacts that are produced as to using these things? And we have to start integrating that into our forensic process, which means that we're looking at and for more and more and more things. We're not losing a lot of things to look at, unfortunately. Cloud computing. Unfortunately, the term is thrown around very loosely, but in essence, if you're talking about computing and a network and remote storage in some fashion, that generically is a cloud. Now, there are some formal definitions for cloud, and I won't go into that for now, but in the end, that's the gist of it. Data can be someplace, there's a connection someplace, and there's an end user someplace. You don't know and you don't care where that data is. When you pick up your phone and you want to see if you have money in the bank, you press on the app and it comes up and it shows that the money is there. Now, you're hoping that it actually went to the bank and looked up and saw if you actually have it. But if you are looking at some pictures, do you know whether they're on your phone or they're up in a cloud someplace? Or are they both? And when you use storage on desktops and laptops now, most of them are encouraging the use of cloud storage that in some ways is mirrored, or in some cases is mirrored to the desktop. So you've got multiple places for those data. So you have the issue sometimes of deduplicating things. Almost all of them rely on forms of virtualization. Service providers can do this a lot of different ways. So for the investigator, it's a huge problem of figuring out who's got the data, where is it, who I need to talk to, and how can we rely on that data? Conversely, for the forensic examiner, they've got to look for the artifacts that show where these things have come and gone. And again, we're really using forensics to help the investigation in very tactical ways, which is not typically how we've operated in the past. The Internet of Things. Basically, you can connect anything on the planet with a network, and we're rapidly approaching that point. Your wireless router at home is not only a wireless router for you at home and the conduit for your internet or your laptop to the internet, but in many cases it's also part of a network of routers that can be controlled, whether it's provided by your wireless vendor or if you have a higher end one that allows remote control. Your security systems, a lot of them share data with the vendors, and similarly, household lighting, Alexa, all of these things share data. Who do they share it with? What do they share? And what's available? And how long is it available for? All really good questions. And it's making the investigator and the forensic scientist's jobs much more difficult. And it's not going to get any easier because everything is becoming a smart device. And so this is a challenge down the pike. Let me back up here. Drones. From the perspective of most people, drones are either an irritant or an amazing play toy, or an incredible workhorse, or all the above. For a forensic examiner, drones are a really interesting problem. They're an interesting problem because they kind of compress everything. In the space of a very small area, you are putting a majority of all the kinds of computing devices that are out there in a very, very small package that are all integrated, all talk to each other, all share data, and in many cases they talk to multiple entities off chip and off the drone itself. And they exist, of course, in three-dimensional geographical space. So it's a fascinating problem. They have some really positive uses, one of which you're going to see here in just a moment. But they're also a real threat to people's security and the privacy of people, and just the tranquility of the Earth. But they're a fascinating forensic challenge, and I've only recently been getting into that, and it's going to be an even bigger area than it is. There already are commercial training organizations that are running multi-day drone forensic training courses, which I think are really good because these are so complex that once you figure out how they work, it's better to learn it than to have to try to figure it out on your own. Drones always have a controller, and very often they may have an additional controller as well. They may actually talk to the drone manufacturer, interestingly enough. And on that controller, you will find numerous artifacts. When the drone was updated, the wireless data of where it connected, application data, what applications have connected to it, log files, where it took off, when it took off, lat, long, altitude, course speed, that sort of stuff. Map data, and if they downloaded or utilized some external application like Before You Fly, because most of these controllers are actually based on a cell phone, so you can utilize the FAA's Before You Fly application, which will tell you whether you're supposed to be flying there or not. All of that is useful data, and most of that comes off the controller. The drone itself has some other artifacts, and some of that in some drones is easily or relatively easily acquired. Some is very difficult to acquire. And last but not least, all drones have a sensor of some sort, whether it's a camera, which it usually is, and you'll have the images and the video, and typically you'll find some of that on the controller and some of that on the drone itself or the storage associated with that drone. And so, and those images typically have all of the kind of metadata that we associate with high-end cameras on the ground, with things like GPS tracking, GPS tagging, et cetera, and all the EXIF metadata for the images or video. So there's a lot of data there, but you've got to ultimately get all three of the pieces if you can. Now, artificial intelligence is another buzzword in today's world, and it's really a collection of a bunch of different technologies, and this list is not by any measure exhaustive, but the ability to use sensors to collect data and to represent that data in preferably real time, and the ability to process language, both oral, verbal, and textual. Machine learning, the ability of computer systems to learn by using mathematical algorithms and pattern matching and that sort of thing, in order to extract information from data and, in theory at least, knowledge from information. And then this whole whole idea of big data, exactly what constitutes big data. You can ask 10 people and they'll give you 10 different answers. But big data is getting bigger and bigger. It has some very, very powerful, very, very useful technological applications, and it has some real potential for forensics. And some of that is being looked at, and that's a good thing. But the problem that I'm going to have as a forensic examiner is if I now have processed a petabyte drive using artificial intelligence, how do I explain to the court or the jury what I did and how I did it? And is that really going to allow that evidence to be utilized in court? Is it going to be admitted? And that's problematic. I know there's a recent case, I believe in New York, where a judge basically wouldn't allow Google geolocation information because the government didn't provide a sufficient foundation for its reliability. I haven't read the opinion, so I can't get into specifics with it, but if that's a problem, what am I going to do about big data? That's even more difficult. So in a lot of ways, the future is already here. Just 2 weeks ago, this was an article that came out in Government Computing News that a open source tool developed by a self-taught developer, basically was able to code a drone to be able to do grid searches and identify indications of assistance or disaster, and would map those and bring it back and create a map of all of the disaster area. And that was done with a commercial drone with a self-taught programmer. So the future is already here, and I think it's going to be a really interesting time for the generations of forensic examiners that go past me. And so I sadly have finished my part of the presentation a little bit sooner than I had planned, which gives us plenty of time for questions. One of the questions was, will the PowerPoint be made available? My understanding is yes, it will.
You waiting for questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Question: is it possible to discuss IP tracing and any problems with that evidence? I wish that I could, only because it's been so long since I've done it. I'm not sure exactly what in particular you were concerned about with respect to IP tracing. As everybody knows, IPs are how data moves from point to point and how it's routed, how it's directed. It's when it works normally, it becomes a game of collecting pearls in a string, basically. The problem comes when you throw something in the middle of that and change things around. And you have something like a VPN, or you have somebody that is running a two-homed server or something like that, where those packets are translated into other locations. I'm not sure I know exactly what problems you're concerned about, but I'm happy to take a shot if you have anything in particular you want to ask. Further resources on reading governing boards and protocols for digital evidence examiners. Okay, two things. One, I had gotten a previous question about certifications as well. Certifications are really a tough issue. There have been a number of certifications in the digital forensic arena over the years. The very first non-governmental, let me back up one. From my perspective, there are three kinds of certifications. There are agency certifications. When you become a forensic examiner in the FBI laboratory, you get a sheepskin that says, in my case, computer evidence examiner, and the agency is saying, we now recognize you as such. Put those aside. The next group are what I call the vendor certifications. You go to the vendor's place, or they come to you, wherever, and you go through a week or 2 weeks using their product, and their instructors teach you how to use their product. To be fair, some of them do a much better job at teaching the underlying foundation knowledge and skills. Some of them are merely teaching people how to push buttons, and that training can be from one day to several weeks. Some of the larger vendors have whole progressions of courses that can be taken. And these certifications basically demonstrate your abilities to use that particular tool. The last one are the general certifications, if you will, the professional certifications. And I've been involved in helping to develop a number of them. And there have been a number of them, and there are still some out there that are pretty good. And I'm not going to get into an argument about which ones are and aren't, but the problem is this: developing and maintaining professional certification tests and proficiency exams, et cetera, is a very expensive and time-consuming process. Having been through it several times, it is really painful and it is really expensive. The problem is, in our field, in digital forensics, very few places have any requirement for holding a professional certification. It's not typically a requirement for a job. It's not typically a requirement to maintain a job. It's not typically required as something for admission as an expert per se. So as a result, people, and in many cases agencies, say, why should I pay several $100s to get the certification and a couple $100 every year to maintain this and take the examination every so many years, and I'm not seeing any benefit from it. And that's kind of the sad part. In other forensic disciplines, being board certified matters. It is part of a job description. In some cases, it's recognized and rewarded. And in many cases, it's funded. But in digital forensics, that's not been the case. So unfortunately, it's been clouded further by a fair number of groups that have given themselves all kinds of fancy names and claim to be doing professional certification, and they're in effect degree mills. And so telling the good ones from the bad ones are a little difficult. But in the end, I would say if somebody says that they have a certification, then I would ask, I would do the research to find out, well, what does that really mean? Did they have to go to school? Did they have to take a test? What did that test entail? Do they have to take proficiency exams? What is the requirement there? So that's not a good answer. But unfortunately, it's tough enough in the federal system where you have relatively large budgets and pretty standardized human resources management procedures. Trying to enforce that in agencies that have much smaller numbers of people and much smaller budgets, it's just not been doable, at least in the past. So that's a real issue. What was the other part of that? What is your opinion as to the author of the words on the highway? Inquiry for document. I'm not sure I understand that question. How does the new Marcy's Law affect electronic records? I am not an attorney, and I don't know. What issues are there with digital information being planted on a computer, potentially as a form of misdirection? There is always a concern with the source origin of information on a computer. we don't have the ability to just say, okay, this definitely came from that person, at least given our current situation. So we really have to rely on triangulation first and foremost. Right? If there's one document with very little or obfuscated metadata that says that's a smoking gun, and nothing else points to it, and nothing else seems to fit with it, then it should, you should do a full-blown exam to see if there's something that happened there. The problem may not be easy to solve, though, because unfortunately, most computers are not secured very well. Most people do not physically protect their computers as well as they should. Second of all, then you get to the next level up, which is the targeted or general malware. Targeted meaning that you want it to be used on one particular computer for one particular purpose. And you have a thumb drive and you stick it in somebody's computer as they walk by, as opposed to the general malware that you get when you download something that is a phishing expedition more generally, or something like that. Those sorts of malware are targeted at a large group of people, and those tend to leave pretty identifiable signatures. The ones that are really, really good, that may come from high-level hackers, intelligence agencies, those are going to be a lot harder to find. But I always say that it's all a totality of circumstances. The chances of finding a single piece of evidence on a computer, I won't say always, but it's very often uncommon. People tend to use computers particularly repetitively, so I'm not sure that answered the question, but if it is a form of misdirection, at some point, like any analogy, that's going to break down, and so that's, and then you have to start working backwards and say, okay, how did that misdirection start? Okay, here's that electronic evidence. How did that get there? Can we tell? We may or may not be able to tell. Trusted sources to follow or subscribe to keep up to speed as much as possible, particularly for the prosecutor and defense attorney. I don't have a short answer for that. I don't know what is available to the attorneys so much, but I certainly think that perhaps this site and the National Center for Law and Technologies is a good start. But there are listservs out there that a lot of the investigators and forensic examiners belong to. Some of them are closed, some of them are open. One way of doing it, which frankly was one of my favorites because I didn't have a lot of time to read when I was working, would be to go to some of the conferences and workshops. You go to DFRWS as an example. Even if you don't understand all the stuff that's going on there, you can see what the latest and greatest is. And so that sort of thing is I think, worth doing. Plus, you get a chance to talk to the people who are actually doing this stuff and finding out what problems they're facing. So. I'm going to address one question. I'm going to address the author of it. What is your opinion as to if the author of the words on the highway would become an inquiry for forensic document examiner? how would we need to be trained and certified to work with this type of graffiti? Okay, if I understand the question, if you're saying that graffiti is now, well, I don't know if it is, I guess it is a crime anyway, but if graffiti were a crime and we wanted to scientifically prove the origins of the graffiti, would we give it to the document examiner? And if so, how would we train and certify them to do that? If that's what the question is, then my first response is that just like I was talking about multiple layers of questions, if the message is the thing, if we're talking about gang tags or something like that, then you need not a document examiner, but somebody that's an expert on gangs and gang tags. If you're trying to figure out if the paint used in that tag came from Joe Doke's garage and you had a pail of that, then you send it to a trace evidence or a chemistry person. That's my view, I think, if I understood the question correctly. What would be the first step for a criminal defense attorney to confront digital evidence that is unfavorable? Find an expert. The short answer is yes. One of the things that we have to recognize is that, let me back up a little bit. When I first started getting trained in digital forensics, one of the first courses I went to was an organization called IASIS, which still exists, and it's a highly reputable organization. In those days, we were told to look at absolutely everything and document that we had looked at absolutely everything on the electronic media, to the extent of we were even told to execute everything in a sandbox so that it couldn't do harm, which was okay if you were dealing with small floppy disks, but very quickly that became impossible. Now nobody can look at everything. Now you can flip every bit in a very large data set if you're willing to take the time and the electricity to do that. But in the end, whether you're converting that data to information or knowledge is a different question. And in most cases, the answer is you're not. So if you actually want to look at the data, particularly if you have a context that you may not want to share with the other side, then I absolutely think that you should ask for your own examiner to examine the computer from your context. And then if they come up with something that is exculpatory, then let the government's examiner look at that same evidence, and if it is in fact there and it's just exculpatory, then you've done your job and they've done their job. I would hope that every forensic examiner is going to take a neutral and detached view of it. Now, I'm not stupid. I realize that not everybody plays by the rules, and not everybody sometimes realizes when they're bending those rules. So the best way to deal with that is, I think, to have your own expert. But make sure that you tell them what you're looking for, and that and ask the question. And this is the question I would ask any examiner: is, are there alternative explanations for this? And one of the things about that strength of hypothesis is when I go to try to answer that question is, okay, what are the alternative hypotheses, and what's the strength of those, right, relative to what I've got? So I hope that answered that question. And I see Ann said yes, that I actually got it right about the graffiti. So I'm glad I could help. I think. Don't know. But, so, don't know. Well, I want to thank you for your time. The fact that you spent an hour and 25 minutes listening to me is amazing, and I appreciate you doing that. I hope it was useful to you. Maybe not today, but maybe somewhere down the pike. But as long as we're working towards a common understanding of digital evidence and how to make it better and how to make it more useful, I think we're all going to be safer and hopefully not let the machines run our lives. So with that, thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. Please continue to check the Spotlight section of our homepage on ncstl.org for information on upcoming webinars. All webinars are available on demand and can be found on the Education and Training page of our website. Please make sure to fill out the survey that you will be receiving by email. This survey will enable you to receive your CLE information. Contact our Office of Professional Education at ope@law.stetson.edu for further information or questions. On behalf of Stetson University College of Law, the National Clearinghouse, the Bureau of Justice Assistants, our guest speaker, and myself, thank you for attending today.
The following